The air was heavy with a damp chill the night it began. Pinewood Grove, a town so small it barely warranted a mention on the map, had always been a quiet place. The kind of town where the biggest excitement came from the annual apple pie contest and the rare visit of a wandering sales truck. But on this night, a silence heavier than snow blanketed the streets, and something unseen crept into the air. It started with Alma Pritchard, the elderly widow who ran the post office out of her front parlor. People noticed she wasn't herself at Sunday's potluck, her skin pallid and her movements listless. Her voice, once sharp and cheerful, had turned hollow, like a rustling wind in a hollow tree. By Tuesday, Alma had locked herself in her home. She didn't answer calls or knockings, though a faint, uneven hum could be heard through her curtained windows, a tuneless melody that set teeth on edge. By Wednesday, the town doctor, Henry Marsh, had forced his way inside. What he found wasn't sickness, at least not as he understood it. She just sat there, Henry told anyone who asked, though his eyes betrayed an unease he couldn't shake. Staring at nothing and humming. Her skin was cold, but she wasn't feverish. The way she looked at me, like she could see through me. The next morning, the bakery shut its doors after its owner, Ben Holloway, fell ill. He too had taken on that pale, waxy complexion and distant gaze, his voice reduced to a murmur of incomprehensible words. Then the librarian, Miriam Cox, started speaking in tongues no one recognized. She wandered the town square aimlessly before fainting beside the fountain. By Friday, the illness wasn't contained to just the elderly or infirm. Children began to cough lightly, their breaths shallow. Farmers returned from their fields looking drained, clutching their sides as though something inside them had turned brittle. The school closed, its empty classrooms an eerie contrast to the grim whispers filling the diner and church vestibules. At first, the townsfolk turned to the usual scapegoats. The water tower was suspect, its once rusty shell now suspiciously slick and dark. The weather, too, a dense fog had begun rolling in nightly, clinging to the streets as if reluctant to leave. "It's the factory runoff," some said, pointing toward the derelict research facility on the hill, long abandoned but ever present in whispered warnings not to venture too close. But the strange symptoms weren't consistent with anything people understood. The coughs faded as quickly as they came, replaced by vivid, unsettling dreams and odd compulsions. Those afflicted seemed drawn to the forest bordering Pinewood Grove, stumbling toward its edges at dusk and returning hours later with no memory of where they had been. The town's pastor called for prayers. The mayor ordered a quarantine. Yet neither God nor human intervention seemed to touch the creeping sickness. And through it all, the wind carried the faintest of sounds. Whispers, low and melodic, impossible to place but unmistakable once heard. It moved like a ripple through the town, brushing ears with promises too faint to discern. It wasn't just an illness, some began to whisper themselves. It was something far older. The sun hung low, its weak rays draped over Pinewood Grove like a veil. The forest had taken on an unearthly glow, the trees appearing to shift imperceptibly when stared at for too long. That was when Evelyn Weaver returned. No one knew much about Evelyn, other than that she had left the town years ago to follow the old ways. She was eccentric even then, known for her peculiar remedies and jars filled with pungent herbs. When she appeared in the square that morning, clutching a basket overflowing with sprigs of some dark plant, the murmurs began anew. "This town has gone soft," she said to the gathering crowd, her voice sharp and deliberate. Her eyes, green as moss and unsettlingly bright, swept across the townsfolk. "You've forgotten that the land speaks, and when it does, you'd best listen." Evelyn claimed she had the answer. The plant, which she called corvid root, was unlike anything anyone had seen. its stems twisted in unnatural spirals, its leaves slick and faintly iridescent. She brewed teas and balms, setting up shop in the old apothecary. Within days, the afflicted flocked to her, drawn by whispers of relief and recovery. "Drink it before sundown," she instructed, her hands deftly wrapping vials in wax paper. "Let the forest draw the sickness from you." And it worked, at least it seemed to. Alma Pritchard was the first to regain her strength, though her eyes took on an unnervingly glassy sheen. Ben Holloway returned to baking bread, though he began humming strange tunes under his breath that no one recognized. Even the children stopped coughing, their energy returning in bursts so frenetic they seemed almost feverish. Despite the apparent success, the uneasy whispers didn't stop. Evelyn's plant was unnatural, people said, growing only in the dense woods the townsfolk feared to tread. Those who used it seemed changed, their expressions vacant, and their words laden with something unfamiliar. One night, Evelyn herself was seen walking toward the woods, her lantern a dim glow swallowed by the mist. Someone swore they heard her talking to someone, or something, just beyond the tree line. And though the sickness faded, the town felt no safer. The whispers on the wind grew louder, carrying hints of laughter and words too faint to understand. The forest's glow deepened, the trees seemingly growing taller, their shadows longer. Even the animals acted strangely, rabbits sitting in still, silent groups, as though in solemn vigil. As the unease in Pinewood Grove grew, one question lingered on every tongue. What price had they paid for Evelyn's cure? The forest seemed closer than before, though the pines had stood at the edge of Pinewood Grove for as long as anyone could remember. Their shadows now crept into the town with a quiet insistence. The trees swayed even on windless nights, their tops scraping the starless sky like skeletal fingers. And with them came the voices. At first, only the afflicted noticed. Those who had partaken of Evelyn's cure, Alma, Ben, the children, began murmuring in their sleep, their words strange and fragmented. "The roots, deeper," Ben whispered one night in the bakery, his flour-dusted hands trembling as he shaped a loaf. Others spoke of a calling, a beckoning from within the forest, their voices dreamy and detached. But soon the voices reached everyone. They began faintly, barely audible above the rustle of the trees, but they grew louder with each passing night. They carried a melodic rhythm, a strange harmony that pressed against the edges of consciousness. Some likened them to whispers, others to a distant, mournful chant, but none could agree on the words. "They want something," said Marjorie Tillman, the church organist, her eyes hollow and ringed with exhaustion. She had stopped playing her beloved organ, her hands trembling too much to strike the keys. "They're waiting." No one dared speak it aloud, but they all knew what the voices wanted, to be heard. People began wandering into the woods at dusk, drawn by an unseen pull. Most returned in a daze, their eyes glassy and their memories fractured. "I saw something," Alma muttered to Dr. Marsh after her second trip. "Roots, branches, but they weren't trees. They were..." She trailed off, her expression twisting with confusion and fear. "Were what?" Dr. Marsh pressed, but Alma shook her head, as if speaking the truth would cement its reality. Those who didn't return from the forest came back in other ways. Evelyn's plants, those twisted, iridescent stems, began to appear in unlikely places. A single sprig grew in the crack of the cobblestone fountain. A cluster sprang from the mayor's garden overnight, coiling around the roots of his tomatoes like snakes. The plants seemed alive, their leaves rustling softly in unison, though the air was still. By now, Evelyn's name was spoken in cautious tones. Some praised her for halting the sickness, while others regarded her with wary glances, her presence a growing weight in their lives. She continued her work at the apothecary, her strange remedies now sought not just for the sickness, but for the unnerving anxiety that gripped the town. "It's the forest," Evelyn said one evening, her voice low and deliberate as she handed a tincture to Sarah Porter, a young mother whose child had begun speaking in tongues. "It's older than us, older than this town. It sees us." Sarah's hand froze mid-reach, her face paling. "What does it want?" she whispered. Evelyn didn't answer. Her green eyes glinted in the lamplight, and for a moment it seemed as though she might smile. But she only turned back to her work, leaving Sarah clutching the tincture as though it might shatter. That night the voices grew louder still. Entire households lay awake, trembling beneath their covers as the forest sang its strange, unholy lullaby. And as dawn broke, a new terror gripped Pinewood Grove. The church bell rang, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound of the bell reverberated through the town, its mournful chime echoing off the cold stone buildings. The streets filled with wary faces, townsfolk murmuring questions to one another. The church, like everything in Pinewood Grove, was old, its bell tower unused for decades. The bell itself had hung silently, its rope frayed and its clapper rusted in place. Yet it had rung. Inside the church, Pastor Calloway stood frozen at the altar, staring at the rope that now hung clean and taut, swaying gently as though freshly used. His congregation, once a place of refuge, now felt alien. The stained glass windows seemed darker, their colors muted. And behind the altar, faint but undeniable, the sound of whispers began to rise. It was Evelyn who broke the spell. She arrived as the whispers grew louder, her green eyes sharper than ever. "It's not the bell," she said, her voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. "It's the roots." The townsfolk turned to her in confusion, their fear palpable. "The forest isn't just watching," she continued, stepping toward the altar. "It's growing, it's spreading. The sickness, the voices, they're all part of it. The bell is only the beginning." No one dared to question her. Evelyn had become something of an authority, her strange remedies and cryptic warnings now the closest thing to guidance Pinewood Grove had. And so, when she suggested they gather by the fountain at dusk, they did. The square filled with anxious faces as the sun sank beneath the horizon. Evelyn stood by the fountain, her basket of corvid root at her feet. She held a sprig aloft, its iridescent leaves shimmering in the fading light. "This plant isn't natural," she said. "It grows in the soil of the forest, but it feeds on something deeper, something older. The roots of the forest reach far, but they're not just trees. They're a veil." "A veil?" someone asked, their voice trembling. Evelyn nodded. "A veil between here and there." The crowd shifted uneasily, the weight of her words pressing down like a storm cloud. Evelyn's gaze swept over them, her expression grim. "Whatever the forest is hiding," she said, "it's waking up." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind, carrying with it the faintest hint of whispers. The night had never been so still. Pinewood Grove lay cloaked in an oppressive silence, the kind that made every creak of wood and rustle of leaves feel deafening. Evelyn's words echoed in the minds of the gathered townsfolk. Whatever the forest is hiding, it's waking up. No one dared to speak as they stood by the fountain, clutching lanterns that flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness. The whispers began just past midnight. They rose from the forest like mist, curling over the cobblestones and slipping into the cracks between buildings. This time they weren't faint murmurs, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Faces turned toward the trees at the town's edge, where shadows writhed unnaturally, as though the forest were breathing. "It's calling us," Alma said, her voice unnervingly calm. She took a step toward the forest, her movements deliberate and dreamlike. Others followed, drawn forward by an unseen force, their lanterns swinging like fireflies in the dark. "No!" Evelyn's voice snapped through the air, her green eyes blazing. "You must resist. The forest doesn't want you. It wants your minds, your thoughts. It thrives on what you leave behind." Her words hung in the air, a fragile barrier against the pull of the whispers. Some townsfolk hesitated, their faces taut with the strain of resisting, but others continued forward, their expressions blank and unseeing. Evelyn cursed under her breath and pulled a bundle of corvid root from her basket, lighting it with a match. The leaves hissed and crackled, releasing a thick, pungent smoke that coiled protectively around the fountain. "Stay here," she commanded. "The smoke will keep it at bay." "Where are you going?" Dr. Marsh asked, his face pale. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward the forest, her expression hard. "To end this." She turned toward the trees, her basket in hand, and disappeared into the shadows before anyone could stop her. The town square grew colder as the minutes crawled by. The smoke from the corvid root lingered, forming a hazy dome that muffled the whispers. The townsfolk huddled together, their breaths misting in the air. Time stretched unnaturally, each second feeling like an hour. Then, as the clock struck 3, the whispers stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the sound had been. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation, as though the world itself were holding its breath. A faint glow began to emanate from the forest, pulsating softly like the heartbeat of something immense. And then Evelyn returned. She stumbled into the square, her clothes damp with dew and her hands streaked with blackened soil. Her face was drawn, her eyes wild, but she clutched a bundle of roots and twisted vines in her arms, their leaves shimmering faintly in the lantern light. "I've seen it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The veil. It's alive. It's not a thing. It's a mind." The crowd recoiled, murmurs of fear rippling through them. Evelyn's gaze darted between them, desperate. "It's been here all along, beneath the forest, feeding on us. Every thought, every dream, everything we are, it's been consuming for generations." "What do we do?" someone whispered. Evelyn held up the bundle of roots. "These are its tendrils. They're like an anchor, tying it to this place. If we burn them, we might sever the connection, but it won't let us do it easily." As if on cue, the glow from the forest intensified, spilling into the town square like liquid light. It was beautiful and terrible, bathing everything in an unnatural radiance that made the shadows seem deeper. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "They're here," Evelyn hissed. "Light the fires, quickly." The townsfolk scrambled to obey, gathering kindling and striking matches with shaking hands. The first flame leapt to life at the fountain's base, its orange glow defiant against the encroaching light. Evelyn tossed the bundle of roots into the flames, and the fire hissed and roared, releasing a plume of acrid smoke that spiraled skyward. The whispers turned into a shriek, high, keening, and full of fury. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the shadows around the square twisted violently, reaching toward the flames as if trying to snuff them out. "Keep it burning," Evelyn shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Don't let it go out." The fire grew brighter, its light pushing back the strange glow from the forest. The whispers faltered, their rhythm breaking, as though the forest itself were recoiling. Slowly, agonizingly, the glow began to fade, its edges retreating back toward the trees. And then, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the light vanished entirely. The town was silent once more, the forest standing dark and still. The fire at the fountain smoldered, its embers glowing faintly in the morning light. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and weary, but alive. Evelyn sank to her knees, her strength finally spent. "It's gone," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or, at least it's sleeping again." Dr. Marsh knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Do you think it will come back?" Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the forest, her expression unreadable. "It always does, but we've bought ourselves time." And as the townsfolk began to disperse, returning to homes that felt unfamiliar in the morning light, one thought lingered unspoken among them all. The forest was watching, and one day it would wake again,